Buy me before they do. That's what the 18-year-old girl begged, standing in the dust of the labor girl market. Her voice cut through the jeers, through the clink of coins, straight to the heart of a mountain man who came to town for nothing more than flour and salt. In front of the crowd, he paid the price and led her away. But the market wasn't the only danger. Somewhere in that valley, a powerful rancher swore she belonged to him, and he's got the papers, the law, and the men to take her back. Snow's coming. Hoofbeats follow in the dark. Behind the cabin door, a fire burns low, but there's a secret she carries, something that could change the fate of every family in the valley. It's written on paper sealed with ink older than the rancher's claim, and worth killing for. When the storm hits and the guns come out, one choice will decide everything: give her up and live, or stand and fight for what's right. Before we dive into today's story, I'd love to know where you are watching from. Seeing your comments really reminds me why I do this every day. The bitter wind whipped across the street of Cutter's Crossing, sending loose snow dancing between boot heels and wagon wheels. Elias Thorne's weathered face tightened against the cold as he guided his horse through the late afternoon shadows. His breaths came out in white puffs, matching the steam rising from his mount's flanks after the long ride down from his mountain cabin. The trading post's worn wooden sign creaked overhead as Elias dismounted, his boots crunching in the fresh powder. He'd put off this supply run as long as he could, but with winter settling in hard, he couldn't delay any longer. His careful fingers worked the reins into a quick hitch knot, muscle memory from years in the high country taking over. A burst of rough laughter drew his attention down the street. Through the swirling snow, he made out a crowd gathering near the livery stable. More voices joined in, carrying clearly in the crisp air, despite the wind's persistent moan. Elias tugged his coat tighter, frowning. He preferred avoiding crowds these days, but something in those raised voices pulled at him. Leaving his saddlebags for later, he moved toward the commotion with the measured stride of a man used to reading trouble in the wind. The crowd had formed a rough circle around a makeshift corral, really just rope strung between posts. Steam rose from the pressed-together bodies of the onlookers, along with the sharp smell of whiskey. At the center stood a wiry man in a bowler hat, gesturing with exaggerated flourishes. "Step right up, gentlemen." The auctioneer's voice carried the oily charm of a snake oil salesman. "The labor girl market's got just what you need for the long winter ahead." Elias's jaw tightened. He'd heard of these auctions, technically legal arrangements for indentured service, but everyone knew what they really were. His eyes narrowed as the auctioneer grabbed someone by the arm and yanked them forward. "Strong back, young and healthy," the man proclaimed, shoving a young woman into better view. "Good for any kind of work you need." The girl stumbled but caught herself with unexpected grace. She wore only a thin cotton dress despite the bitter cold, and her dark hair fell in two long braids that marked her Apache heritage. But there was something else in her features, too, a hint of Irish blood perhaps in the set of her cheekbones and the proud lift of her chin. Frost had left an angry red mark on one cheek, but her eyes remained sharp and alert as they scanned the crowd. Those eyes stopped briefly on Elias, and he saw something there that made his chest tighten, not fear or desperation, but a calculating intelligence. "Starting bid at $2, the auctioneer called out. "Who will give me $2 for this fine specimen?" $1.50, a voice called from the crowd, followed by coarse laughter. $2. This from a heavy-set man near the front, well-dressed in a fine wool coat. Elias recognized Silas Cobb, one of the valley's biggest ranchers. The way Cobb looked at the girl made Elias's hand instinctively drift toward his belt knife. The girl must have seen something in Cobb's expression, too. Her eyes found Elias again, and this time she spoke, her voice carrying clearly despite its softness. "Buy me before they do." The simple statement hit Elias like a physical blow. He'd come to town for supplies, nothing more. He had no business getting involved in other folks' troubles. 10 years of solitude in the mountains had taught him the wisdom of minding his own affairs. But something in those 4 words reached past his carefully built walls. Maybe it was the quiet dignity in her tone, or the way she'd sized him up and made her choice. Whatever the reason, Elias found his hand rising before he'd fully decided to act. $2.50, he called out, his deep voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. Cobb's head snapped around, his face darkening as he recognized Elias. $3, he countered immediately. $3.50. Elias kept his voice level, though his heart had started hammering against his ribs. $4. Cobb's face had grown red now, his hands clenching into meaty fists at his sides. Elias felt the weight of his remaining coins in his pocket. He'd brought just enough for winter supplies, and he was already spending money he couldn't afford to lose. But the girl's eyes were on him again, steady and knowing. $4.25, he said quietly. The auctioneer's head swiveled between the two men, sensing the tension crackling like static before a storm. $4.25, going once. Cobb's jaw worked, but he stayed silent. Going twice. The rancher's hand twitched toward his coat pocket, then stopped. Sold. The auctioneer's gavel cracked against a wooden post. To the mountain man for $4.25. The crowd began to disperse, grumbling about the entertainment being over. Cobb remained, his pale eyes fixed on Elias with ugly promise. This ain't finished, Thorne, he growled. You just bought yourself a heap of trouble. Reckon I've had my share before, Elias replied evenly. Much obliged for your concern. Cobb spat in the snow and turned away, shouldering roughly through the remaining onlookers. Elias watched him go, then approached the corral where the auctioneer was already counting out his coins. The girl hadn't moved, though her arms were wrapped tightly around herself now, her shoulders shaking slightly from the cold. Up close, Elias could see she was younger than he'd first thought, probably no more than 20 summers. He shrugged out of his heavy coat and held it out to her. She hesitated only a moment before taking it, drawing it around herself with careful movements. Got a horse tied up at the mercantile, he said, keeping his voice gentle. Need to fetch some supplies before heading back up the mountain. You can wait in there where it's warm. She nodded, then spoke again in that same quiet, clear voice. My name is Maria Greyhawk. Elias Thorne, he answered simply. They walked together through the swirling snow, neither speaking further. But Elias could feel the weight of her measured gaze, sizing him up just as carefully as he was studying her. There were questions that needed asking, and answers that would need to be given. But for now, the wind was rising, and the day growing old. Elias led the way toward the mercantile, his mind already turning over the changes this day had brought. He'd come down the mountain for supplies, nothing more. Now he found himself responsible for another life, with Silas Cobb's threat hanging in the air like wood smoke. The girl, Maria, walked beside him with straight-backed dignity despite her shivers. Whatever circumstances had brought her to that auction block, Elias could see she was no one's victim. She'd made her own choice in calling out to him, and he suspected she had her own reasons for doing so. The mercantile's bell jingled as they stepped inside, warmth washing over them in a welcome wave. Maria drew his coat closer around her shoulders, and Elias saw the first hint of relief touch her features as feeling returned to her frost-nipped skin. He'd learned long ago that some choices once made became turning points that couldn't be undone. As he watched Maria warm herself by the pot-bellied stove, Elias knew in his bones that this was one of those moments. Whatever trouble he'd bought himself along with her freedom, there would be no going back to his solitary life in the mountains. The wind howled outside, and somewhere in that sound, Elias thought he heard the echo of changes yet to come. Inside Wilson's general store, the pot-bellied stove radiated welcome heat. Elias moved efficiently through the aisles, gathering his supplies while keeping Maria within sight. She stood near the fabric bolts, still wrapped in his coat, her fingers trailing over soft calico she clearly couldn't afford. Mrs. Wilson, the storekeeper's wife, watched from behind the counter with pinched lips. Other customers gave Maria a wide berth, their whispers following her like shadows. Elias had seen that look before, folks making judgments without knowing the whole story. Need the usual? He told Mr. Wilson gruffly. Flour, salt, and kerosene, double portion of each. He laid his money on the counter, including extra for warm clothing for Maria. Wilson nodded, though his eyes kept drifting to Maria. Heard about what happened at the auction? Risky business, Thorn. Getting mixed up in... Just the supplies. Elias cut him off, his tone brooking no argument. Once Maria had proper winter clothes, thick wool stockings, sturdy boots, and a heavy coat of her own, they stepped back into the biting wind. Elias's buckskin mare stood patient at the hitching post, frost collecting on her mane. Up you go, he said, making a stirrup with his hands. Maria hesitated only a moment before placing her boot in his palms. He lifted her smoothly onto the horse's back, then mounted behind her. They rode north out of town, the mare's hooves crunching through fresh snow. Dark clouds roiled over the ridges ahead, promising more weather. Maria sat straight in the saddle, though Elias could feel her shivering against him. The storm hit faster than he'd expected. Snow squalls swept down from the peaks, cutting visibility to arm's length. Wind howled through the pines, drowning out the mare's labored breathing. Elias knew these mountains well enough to find the line shack, a simple shelter used by ranch hands in better weather. We'll wait it out, he said, helping Maria dismount. The cabin was rough but sound, with a small fireplace and stack of dry wood left by previous travelers. Soon, a modest fire crackled in the hearth. Maria huddled close to the flames, her new coat drawn tight. Elias heated coffee in his tin pot, passing her a steaming cup. Thank you, she said softly. After a long silence broken only by the wind's moan, she began to speak. After my mother died last spring, men came to our homestead. Said Father's old mining debts had to be paid. Her fingers tightened around the cup, but Father kept careful books, I'd seen them. There was no debt. Elias listened, stoking the fire with careful movements. They took everything, the cattle, the tools, even Mother's silver cross. Maria's voice caught. When that wasn't enough, they took me. Said I'd work off what was left. She lifted her chin. But it was the spring they wanted all along. The sacred water that sustained my mother's people for generations. Elias's jaw clenched, but he kept his anger in check. He'd seen too many similar stories in these territories. Greed dressed up as law, might masquerading as right. They slept in shifts, Elias taking the longer watch. By dawn, the storm had blown itself out, leaving the world draped in fresh white. The mare had weathered the night well in the lean-to, and they set out under clearing skies. Here, Elias said once they reached Wider Trail. He handed Maria the reins. Keep her head up. Let her pick her footing through the drifts. Maria took the leather straps with quiet confidence. Her hands were sure, her seat natural in the saddle. The mare responded well to her touch, and Elias saw some of the tension ease from her shoulders as she guided them higher into the mountains. The sun was setting when they finally crested the last ridge. His cabin stood in a protected hollow, smoke curling from the chimney where the fire he'd banked that morning still smoldered. It wasn't much. Rough-hewn logs chinked with mud, a stone chimney, small windows with oiled paper. But it was solid and warm. Inside, Elias built up the fire while Maria stood just inside the door, taking in the simple space. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, and a few books sat on a crude shelf. His bed occupied one corner, while his workbench filled another. You can sleep there, he said, pointing to a corner he'd quickly arranged with clean blankets. I'll take the floor by the fire. He heated up the last of his venison stew, serving it in wooden bowls with hardtack. They ate in comfortable silence, the fire popping and hissing in the hearth. Maria's eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but some of the wariness had left her face. When she finally curled up in her corner bed wrapped in thick blankets, Elias noticed she kept one hand near the knife he'd given her for the stew. He approved of the precaution. Trust had to be earned, even from those who meant well. He settled onto his bedroll near the fire, one ear tuned to the night sounds outside. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, at least, she was safe. Dawn broke over a transformed landscape. The storm had left a pristine foot of snow draped across the valley, turning Elias's familiar world into something new and untouched. Pine boughs sagged under their white burden, and icicles gleamed from the cabin's eaves. Maria stood in the doorway, wrapped in her wool coat, watching as Elias demonstrated how to split kindling. His axe struck true with practiced swings, the wood falling into neat pieces. "Like this," he said, offering her the axe handle. "Let the weight do the work." She gripped it carefully, mimicking his stance. Her first few attempts glanced off, but soon she found the rhythm. A small pile of kindling grew beside her boots. "Good," Elias nodded. "Fire's hungry in winter, never too much wood split." Inside, he showed her how to bank the stove, explaining the delicate balance between choking out the flame and keeping coals alive through the night. Maria listened intently, her quick mind grasping the details. After a breakfast of cornmeal mush, Elias brought out his snowshoes. The rawhide webbing was well worn but sound, and he helped Maria adjust the bindings over her boots. "Might feel strange at first," he warned. "Walk wide, keep your weight centered." They practiced near the cabin, Maria stumbling at first but soon finding her balance. Her determination showed in the set of her jaw, in how quickly she rose when she fell. By mid-morning, she was ready to accompany him to check his trapline. The day was bright and cold, their breath clouding in the crystalline air. Elias pointed out tracks in the snow, rabbit, fox, deer, teaching her to read the stories written there. At each trap, he demonstrated proper handling, showing respect for both tool and prey. When they found a snowshoe hare, he guided her through the skinning process. Her hands proved steady and sure, waste not principles clearly familiar to her from her mother's teachings. "My mother showed me similar ways," she said softly, working the pelt free, though she used different words for things. Elias noticed how her eyes kept drifting to the southern mountains, their peaks sharp against the winter sky. That was where her mother's people, the San Juan Apache, made their winter camps. Something in her gaze spoke of longing, of connections pulled tight but not broken. Days settled into comfortable routine. They shared tasks and simple meals, speaking little but understanding growing between them. Maria proved an able partner in the daily work of survival, her presence somehow making the cabin feel more like a home than it had in years. One evening, as they sat before the fire sharing fresh cornbread, Maria spoke up hesitantly. "Your shirt cuffs are wearing thin," she observed. "I could mend them if you'd like. I have some cloth from an old dress hem." Elias looked down at his frayed cuffs, surprised he hadn't noticed their state. "Much obliged," he said quietly, touched by the offer. The peaceful moment shattered at the sound of approaching hoofbeats crunching through the snow. Elias was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. He motioned Maria to stay back from the windows. "Stay here," he said, stepping out onto the porch. A single rider approached through the gathering dusk, his horse blowing steam in the cold air. Elias recognized young Tommy Wilson, the store clerk from Cutter's Crossing. The boy's face was red from the cold, and something else, anxiety clear in his rigid posture. "Mr. Thorne," Tommy called, reining up short of the cabin. "Got a message to deliver." "Speak your piece," Elias said, rifle lowered but ready. Tommy swallowed hard. "It's about the girl. Mr. Cobb says he has legal claim to her. Says she's bound by a debt contract from her father's mining days." The boy shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "He's got papers drawn up by Judge Whitaker himself. Says he's coming to collect what's his." Elias's face hardened, but he kept his voice level. "That's so?" "Yes, sir." Mr. Cobb seemed mighty certain about it. Tommy glanced nervously at the cabin. He wasn't pleased about the auction. Said some things about setting matters straight. Through the cabin window, Elias caught a glimpse of Maria's face, pale in the firelight. He knew what setting matters straight meant to men like Silas Cobb. The rancher's reputation for dealing harshly with those who crossed him was well known in the territory. "Message delivered," Elias said flatly. "Best head back before full dark." Tommy needed no further encouragement, wheeling his horse around and spurring it down the trail. Elias watched until the hoofbeats faded before returning inside. Maria stood by the fire, her face composed but her hands clenched tight in her skirts. "He's coming, isn't he?" she asked quietly. Elias nodded, checking his rifle's action. "Reckon so." The mountain peaks caught the first rays of dawn as Elias and Maria sat at his rough-hewn table. Steam rose from their tin cups of coffee while Elias explained the situation in measured words. "Cobb's got influence all through this valley," he said, his weathered face grave. "Controls most everything that matters. Water rights, grazing lands. Marshal's office listens when he talks." Maria's fingers tightened around her cup. "The debt he claims? It's false. My father died owing nothing to that man. Mother told me so many times." Her voice was quiet, but firm. "I won't go back to him." Elias studied her determined expression, recognizing the same steel he'd seen in her eyes at the auction. "Ain't asking you to." He rose from the table, reaching for his coat. "Need to ride into town, talk to someone who might help." The morning air bit sharp and clean as Elias guided his horse down the snow-covered trail to Cutter's Crossing. The town was stirring to life when he arrived, smoke rising from chimneys, storekeepers sweeping their boardwalks clear of snow. He found Reverend Wycliffe in his small church, polishing brass candlesticks for Sunday service. The preacher's kind face turned serious as Elias explained about Maria and Cobb's claim. "Silas Cobb," Reverend Wycliffe sighed, setting down his polishing cloth. "Man's got a way of twisting the law to serve his wants. Tried to seize Widow Carson's creek rights last spring. Took 3 months of fighting in territorial court to stop him." "What chances we got?" Elias asked plainly. The Reverend stroked his gray beard thoughtfully. "Law might side with him unless we can prove the debt claim false. Any papers from her father? Letters? Receipts?" Elias shook his head. "Nothing I know of." "Then we're in for a fight." Reverend Wycliffe's eyes held both worry and resolve. "I'll help how I can, but be careful, Elias. Cobb doesn't take kindly to interference." The sun was setting behind the mountains when Elias returned to his cabin. He found Maria had been busy, fresh split wood stacked neat and high against the wall, and the rich smell of rabbit stew filling the air. "Snared it myself," she said quietly as he hung up his coat. "Want to earn my keep?" "No need for that," Elias replied, but his tone was appreciative. They sat down to bowls of steaming stew, cornbread crumbled on top. Between bites, they discussed their options. "Could take you to Johnson's place," Elias suggested. "He's got a trap line 2 valleys over, or the Weber brothers up north." Maria shook her head. "More folks at risk. Better I stay here if you're willing." "Might need to ride to the county seat," Elias continued. "Contest Cobb's claim proper-like, but that's 3 days hard riding, and snow coming." "He'll expect that," Maria said. "Better to wait. Learn more about these papers he claims to have." Elias nodded slowly, seeing the wisdom in her words. "Then we stay put for now. Keep watch." After supper, he cleaned his Winchester rifle with careful attention, then propped it beside the door where it would be close at hand. Maria watched him from her corner bed, wrapped in the quilt he'd given her. "Thank you," she said softly, "for standing against him. No, it's not your fight." Elias paused in his work, considering her words. "Man's got to choose his ground sometimes," he replied finally. "This seems like proper ground to me." Outside, snow began falling in thick, silent flakes. The wind had died completely, leaving the valley still and hushed. Elias added wood to the stove, banking it carefully for the night. The familiar tasks felt different now, weighted with new purpose. He settled into his own bed, listening to the soft sounds of Maria's breathing across the cabin. The snow continued falling, wrapping their small shelter in layers of white silence. His last thought before sleep was of the rifle by the door, and the promise it represented, that some things were worth defending, no matter the cost. The snow fell steadily through the night, nature's blank page covering the valley in pristine white, while inside the cabin, 2 souls found rest in the strange comfort of shared purpose and mutual trust. Morning broke over the mountains in a dazzling display of sunlight on fresh snow. The temperature had plummeted overnight, leaving frost patterns like delicate lace across the cabin's small window panes. Elias pulled on his heavy coat and glanced at Maria, who was already wrapping herself in the wool shawl he'd given her. "Time to check the snares," he said, reaching for his snowshoes. "Reckon you might want to learn how it's done." Maria nodded eagerly, watching carefully as he showed her how to strap on the spare pair of snowshoes. She stumbled at first, but soon found her balance, following his lead across the sparkling snow. "Look here." Elias pointed to tiny impressions in the powder. "Rabbit tracks. See how they bunch up close together? Means they're moving slow, probably browsing for food." He traced the pattern with his finger. When they're scared, tracks spread out wider. Maria leaned in close, studying the marks intently. "Like reading a story in the snow," she said softly. They checked 3 snares, finding 1 empty and 1 broken. At the third, a plump snowshoe hare hung still and white. Elias demonstrated how to reset the snare, his movements precise and practiced. "Your turn," he said, stepping back to let Maria try. Her fingers, though cold, worked the wire carefully until the snare sat just right. "Well done," he nodded approvingly. "You've got a good eye for it." On their return journey, they came to Spring Creek, usually an easy crossing. Now it lay frozen, a ribbon of white between snow-laden banks. Elias tested the ice with his boot. "Seems solid enough," he said. "I'll go first. You follow my exact steps." He took 3 careful steps onto the ice. On the 4th, a sharp crack split the morning silence. Before either could react, the surface gave way beneath him. Elias plunged through, the freezing water stealing his breath as it soaked him to the waist. "Elias!" Maria's cry cut through the air. Without hesitation, she dropped to her belly, spreading her weight across the ice, and crawled toward him. Her hands found his shoulders, gripping tight. "Push up when I pull," she commanded, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. She heaved backward with all her strength. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Elias found purchase with his boots and pushed. Together, they managed to drag him onto solid ice. Maria kept pulling until they reached the bank, where Elias collapsed, his legs already growing numb. "Can't stop here," Maria said firmly. She pulled him to his feet, ducking under his arm. "Lean on me." The journey back to the cabin seemed endless. Elias's wet clothes began to freeze, and his steps grew increasingly unsteady. Maria bore more and more of his weight, her breath coming in sharp bursts, but she never slowed. Inside the cabin, she took charge with quiet efficiency. She stoked the fire until it roared, then helped him out of his frozen clothes and into dry ones. She wrapped him in every blanket they had, then heated rocks in the fireplace and tucked them around him. Elias's violent shivering gradually eased as warmth seeped back into his bones. He watched through half-closed eyes as Maria moved about the cabin, keeping the fire blazing and preparing hot coffee. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice rough. "Been a long time since I had help like that." Maria handed him a steaming cup. "You've been alone too long, I think." "Reckon you're right about that." He took a careful sip. "Got used to handling everything myself. Sometimes forget there's other ways." As evening settled in, they sat close to the fire, its warmth a comfort against the memory of the day's cold. Elias found himself telling her about his years trapping in the Bitterroot Mountains, tales of grizzly bears and mountain storms, a valley so remote they might never have seen a human footprint. Maria listened intently, then shared her own story, of her mother, a proud Apache woman who had loved an Irish miner and refused to be ashamed of either heritage. "She taught me to walk with my head high," Maria said, her voice soft with memory. "Even when people turned away or spoke cruel words, she never bent. Said truth and courage were worth more than others' good opinion." "Wise woman," Elias commented quietly. "Yes," Maria agreed, gazing into the fire. "She fought for our spring until the end, said water rights were sacred, not something to be bought or stolen. Even when she was sick, she wouldn't give in to Cobb's demands." The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Elias felt a deep gratitude, not just for the day's rescue, but for the simple presence of another soul willing to share the weight of solitude. He had forgotten how it felt to trust, to depend on someone else's strength when his own failed. The evening passed in quiet conversation, each story a small bridge across the years of isolation they had both endured. Outside, the temperature continued to drop, but inside the cabin, something frozen had begun to thaw. A week of quiet routine had settled over the cabin. The morning sun cast long shadows across fresh powder when the distinct jingle of sleigh bells drifted up from the valley. Elias moved to the window, rifle ready, but relaxed when he recognized Reverend Wycliffe's bay team pulling his covered sleigh through the deep snow. "Reverend's coming," he called to Maria, who was mending clothes by the fire. She quickly set aside her work and smoothed her hair, conscious of receiving their first visitor. The sleigh runners whispered to a stop outside the cabin. Reverend Wycliffe emerged, his breath clouding in the crisp air as he wrapped his heavy buffalo coat tighter. His usually cheerful face was drawn with concern. "Brother Thorne," he called out, climbing the path Elias had cleared to the door. "Got some matters need discussing if you've time." "Always time for you, Reverend," Elias replied, opening the door wide. "Come in where it's warm." Maria had already put coffee on to boil and set out 3 tin cups on the rough-hewn table. The Reverend nodded gratefully to her as he settled into the offered chair, removing his gloves to warm his hands by the stove. "Wish I was bringing better news," Wycliffe said after taking a warming sip of coffee. "But Silas Cobb's been busy down in the county seat. Filed papers yesterday. Serious ones." Elias's face hardened. "What kind of papers?" "He's accusing you of harboring stolen property, meaning Miss Maria here." The Reverend's voice was gentle but grave. "Claims you've no right to keep her from fulfilling her debt contract. But that's not the worst of it." Maria's hands tightened around her cup. "What else?" "He's threatening to petition for your land, Elias. Says he'll claim it as compensation for his losses." Wycliffe shook his head. "Man's gotten mighty bold with his new connections in the territorial office." Elias remained standing, his stance rigid. "That all of it?" The Reverend hesitated, glancing at Maria. "There's something else. Been hearing whispers about why Cobb's so set on this particular fight. Seems there's a spring near your old homestead, Miss Maria. One that waters half the valley in dry seasons." Maria's face went pale. "My mother's spring." "Exactly so. Word is Cobb's been trying to gain control of those water rights for years. Would give him power over every small ranch and farm downstream." Wycliffe leaned forward. "But I reckon he's never been able to prove clear title to that land or the water rights. That's why he's coming at it sideways now, through this supposed debt of yours." Silence filled the cabin, broken only by the pop and crackle of the fire. Maria stood suddenly, moving to the corner where her few belongings lay. From beneath her bed, she pulled out a worn leather Bible. "Mama knew this might happen," she said softly. Her fingers worked at the Bible's binding, carefully separating a hidden seam in the leather. "She told me to keep this safe, no matter what." From the concealed space, she withdrew a folded document, yellowed with age but still intact. With trembling hands, she brought it to the table. "It's the original land grant," she explained, carefully unfolding the brittle paper. "Signed when the territory was still Mexican land. It gives my family full rights to the spring and surrounding acres. In perpetuity, Mama always said." Elias moved closer, studying the elaborate seal and flowing script. His eyes widened as he recognized the significance of what he was seeing. "This is real," he said quietly. "A legal grant, with all the proper marks. This could undo everything Cobb's trying to do." Reverend Wycliffe examined the document with growing excitement. More than that, it could stop him from controlling the whole valley. This grant predates any claim he could make. Maria looked up at Elias, hope and determination mixing in her eyes. "We need to take this to the county seat. File it properly before Cobb can push through his petition against you." "Journey's dangerous this time of year," Elias warned, though his tone suggested he was already considering the best route. 2 days at least, with the passes drifted deep. Might be more if another storm hits. "I don't care," Maria said firmly. "My mother died protecting our rights to that spring. She knew how many families depended on that water flowing free. I won't let Cobb take it now. Reverend Wycliffe nodded approvingly. The Lord works in mysterious ways. That document surviving all these years, hidden away safe, might be just the miracle this valley needs. Elias walked to the window, studying the snow-covered landscape. The weather had held clear for several days, but winter storms could sweep in with little warning. Yet waiting carried its own risks. Cobb's influence grew stronger by the day. We'll need supplies, he said finally, turning back to Maria. Warm clothes, extra food, no telling what we might run into on the trail. I can help with that, Wycliffe offered. My wife has some winter things that might fit Miss Maria, and I'll bring by provisions tomorrow. Dried meat, hard bread, the sorts of things that'll keep well. Maria carefully refolded the precious document and returned it to its hiding place in the Bible. How soon can we leave? Day after tomorrow if the weather holds, Elias replied. Need time to get the horses ready. Plan the route careful-like. Can't afford mistakes, not with what's at stake. The Reverend rose to leave, pulling his gloves back on. I'll pray for your safe journey, and I'll keep an eye on things here while you're gone. Cobb's got friends watching your cabin. Might be best if they see me visiting regular, making it look like nothing's changed. Elias walked him to the door. Much obliged, Reverend, for everything. Just doing the Lord's work, Wycliffe replied with a small smile. Sometimes that means standing up to men like Cobb, who'd take what ain't theirs to take. After seeing the Reverend off, Elias and Maria began taking stock of what they'd need for the journey. The afternoon passed in quiet preparation, checking blankets, sorting through warm clothes, discussing which routes would be safest through the snow-filled passes. As evening settled in, Maria sat by the fire, her mother's Bible in her lap. Her fingers traced the worn cover, following the path to the hidden seam where the document lay protected. Thank you, she said softly to Elias, who was reviewing his maps by lamplight, for being willing to risk this journey, for helping me fight for what's right. Elias looked up, his weathered face softening in the golden light. Your mama sounds like she was a brave woman, standing up to Cobb all those years. Reckon the least I can do is help her daughter finish what she started. Outside, the wind picked up, whispering through the pines. Tomorrow would bring more preparation, more planning for the dangerous journey ahead. But tonight, in the warm cabin, hope burned as steady as the flames in the hearth. Hope that justice might finally prevail in the snow-covered valley that both Elias and Maria had come to call home. Dawn painted the snow-laden mountains in shades of rose and gold as Elias and Maria prepared for their journey. Inside the warm cabin, they packed their saddlebags with careful precision. Dried venison strips wrapped in clean cloth, hard biscuits that would keep for days, a small sack of coffee beans and a battered tin pot. 3 days to the county seat, Elias said, checking the loads on his rifle. Maybe 4, with the snow. He glanced at Maria, who was rolling extra blankets into tight bundles. You sure about this? Maria nodded, tucking her mother's Bible securely into her own saddlebag. More sure than I've been about anything. Outside, their breath clouded in the bitter morning air as they loaded the buckskin mare. The horse's hooves crunched through the crusty snow, breaking through to powder underneath. Elias helped Maria mount, then swung up behind her. With one last look at the cabin, they set off down the trail. They stuck to the shadows of the tree line, avoiding the main valley road where Cobb's men might be watching. The mare picked her way carefully through the drifts, steam rising from her flanks. By midday, they had descended into the lower valley, where naked cottonwoods stood like sentinels along the frozen creek beds. There's an old trapper's lean-to ahead, Elias said as afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow. Good place to shelter for the night. The lean-to was little more than 3 walls of rough-cut logs with a slanting roof, but it blocked the worst of the wind. They cleared away old leaves and built a small fire in the stone ring out front. The flames cast dancing shadows as they shared a meal of venison and biscuits. I'll take first watch, Elias offered, settling back against a log with his rifle across his knees. Get some rest. Maria wrapped herself in blankets near the fire. Wake me for my turn. I can keep watch too. They traded shifts through the long night, keeping the small fire alive against the probing wind. Coyotes called in the distance, their voices echoing off the valley walls. The second day dawned clear but bitter cold. They reached the river ford by mid-morning, where the water ran shallow enough to freeze solid. But something made Elias rein up short of the crossing. Fresh tracks marked the snow on the far bank. "Riders," he said quietly, studying the hoof prints. 4, maybe 5 horses. Passed through not more than an hour ago. Maria tensed behind him. "Cobb's men?" "Likely." Elias turned the mare away from the ford. "They'll be watching the road into town. We'll have to go around." They detoured through a steep pine ridge, the mare struggling through deep drifts between the trees. The rough terrain and careful going cost them precious hours. By sunset, they were still far short of where Elias had hoped to be. The third morning broke with heavy clouds building in the west, the kind that promised snow. They pushed on through the early hours, trying to make up lost time. The county seat was less than 10 miles ahead when the storm hit. The blizzard swept in like a white curtain, cutting visibility to arm's length. Wind howled through the trees, driving snow sideways. The temperature plummeted as the storm gathered strength. "There's an old stage station ahead," Elias shouted over the wind. "If we can find it in this." They let the mare pick her way forward, trusting her instincts more than their own snowblind eyes. After what felt like hours, dark shapes emerged from the whiteout. The square bulk of the abandoned station house, its windows boarded over. Elias dismounted and helped Maria down, then led the horse around to the lee side of the building, where a lean-to shelter still stood. Inside the station house, dust and old hay covered the plank floor, but the roof was sound. They found dry wood stacked in a corner and soon had a small fire going in the old stone fireplace. María se acurrucó cerca de las llamas, frotando el sentimiento de nuevo en sus dedos congelados. How long will the storm last? Hard to say. Elias moved to one of the windows, pulling aside the rough boards to peer out at the swirling snow. These mountain blizzards can blow themselves out in hours, or last for days. "And Cobb's men will be waiting on the road into town," Maria added quietly. "Aye." Elias returned to the fire, feeding it another stick of wood. "But we've got shelter, food, and dry wood. We'll wait it out." Outside, the wind moaned around the corners of the old station house. The storm showed no signs of letting up as evening approached. They shared another meal of trail food, rationing carefully in case their stay stretched longer than planned. The abandoned station creaked and settled around them as darkness fell. Through gaps in the boards, they could see the snow still falling thick and fast, turning the world beyond their shelter into a white void. The wind howled through the night, rattling the loose boards of the stagecoach station. Elias and Maria took turns feeding the fire, keeping the small flame alive against the darkness. Snow hissed against the walls, driven by fierce gusts that found every crack and seam in the old building. Maria huddled beneath her blankets, watching sparks dance up the stone chimney. "Sounds like the whole mountain's trying to come down." "Storm's got a voice of its own," Elias agreed, adding another stick to the fire. The wood popped and crackled, sending up a shower of orange sparks. They dozed fitfully as the hours crept past, the blizzard's fury gradually diminishing to a steady fall of snow. When dawn finally broke, pale light filtered through the gaps in the boards, revealing a transformed world outside. Elias forced open the door against the drifts piled chest-high. The morning air bit sharp and clean, the storm spent at last. Fresh snow lay deep across the landscape, smoothing every edge and hollow into gentle curves. The mare's shelter was half buried, only the peak of its roof visible above the white expanse. "Need to dig her out," Elias said, trudging through the drifts toward a small shed attached to the station house. Inside, he found what he was looking for, an old snow shovel with a cracked but serviceable handle. The work was hard but necessary. Elias dug steadily, clearing a path to the mare's shelter while Maria gathered their gear inside. The horse nickered softly when he reached her, steam rising from her flanks in the cold air. She had weathered the storm well, protected from the worst of the wind. Good girl. he murmured, brushing snow from her mane. Just a bit further to go. They set out as soon as the sun cleared the eastern ridges. The going was slow at first, breaking trail through the fresh snow, but as they descended toward the valley floor, they found the drifts less deep, packed down by the wind. The mare plodded steadily onward, steam puffing from her nostrils with each breath. Maria sat wrapped in both blankets, while Elias guided them along the safest path. By mid-afternoon, they caught their first glimpse of the county seat, a cluster of wooden buildings and stone government offices nestled in the valley below. Evening was drawing in when they finally rode down the town's main street. Lamplight glowed in shop windows, and smoke rose straight up from chimney stacks in the still, cold air. They dismounted stiffly outside the courthouse, muscles aching from the long ride. "Clerk's office should still be open," Elias said, helping Maria down. He tied the mare to the hitching rail, then stamped snow from his boots as they climbed the courthouse steps. Inside, oil lamps cast a warm glow over polished wooden counters and rows of leather-bound record books. The clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, looked up from his desk with a start. "Can I help you?" he asked, eyes darting between them uncertainly. Elias stepped forward, Maria beside him. "Got a land deed needs filing." Maria withdrew the document carefully from her mother's Bible, unfolding the weathered paper. The clerk adjusted his spectacles, studying the seal and signatures with growing unease. "This is quite an old grant," he said. "And these water rights." He glanced toward the door, then back at them. "Mr. Cobb has certain interests in that area." "The deed's legal," Elias said firmly. "Needs to be recorded." The clerk shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Well, yes, but perhaps we should wait for—" "Now," Elias interrupted quietly, "while there's still light to see by." Something in his tone made the clerk swallow whatever protest he'd been about to make. With trembling fingers, he opened a large ledger book and began copying the details of the grant. "I'll send word to the Territorial Land Office," he said, dipping his pen in ink. "For verification of the original grant, you understand. Could take some weeks for a response." "Long as it's logged here first," Elias replied. They watched as the clerk carefully recorded every detail, his pen scratching across the page. When he finally finished, he sprinkled sand over the wet ink to dry it. "There," he said, sliding the original deed back across the counter. "It's filed, but Mr. Cobb won't be pleased." "Not our concern," Elias said, helping Maria tuck the document safely away. Outside, true darkness had fallen. The temperature was dropping rapidly, stars beginning to shine in the clear sky above. Their breath fogged in the lamplight as they led the tired mare down the street toward a small boarding house. The proprietor, a plump woman named Mrs. Whitaker, took one look at their snow-crusted clothes and clucked her tongue sympathetically. "You poor dears, come in out of that cold. Got hot stew on the stove and fresh bread just out of the oven." The dining room was warm and bright, with a cheerful fire crackling in the hearth. The smell of good food made their trail rations seem very far away. Mrs. Whitaker bustled them to a table and soon returned with deep bowls of steaming beef stew and thick slices of brown bread slathered with butter. Maria closed her eyes at the first spoonful, savoring the taste of a proper hot meal. Even Elias had to admit it was the best thing he'd eaten in days. They were finishing the last of the bread when heavy boots thundered on the boarding house porch. The door burst open, letting in a blast of cold air. Silas Cobb filled the doorway, face red with cold and anger. Two deputies flanked him, hands resting meaningfully on their gun belts. The room fell silent as Cobb's gaze swept across the dining room, finally locking onto Maria. His lips curled in an ugly smile. "Well, well," he drawled. "Quite a chase you've led us on, girl." He took a step forward, spurs jingling. "But it ends here. You can't hide behind papers forever." Elias's hand slipped beneath his coat, but Maria laid her fingers gently on his arm. She met Cobb's stare steadily, her voice quiet, but firm. "The deed is filed, Mr. Cobb. The spring belongs to my family by law." Cobb's face darkened, Without another word, he spun on his heel and stomped out, the deputies trailing in his wake. The door slammed behind them, rattling in its frame. Mrs. Whitaker hurried over, wringing her hands. "Oh, my dears, shall I send for the sheriff?" "No need," Elias said, though his eyes remained fixed on the door. "We'll take those rooms now, if you don't mind." Of course, of course." She gathered up their empty bowls with shaking hands. "Right this way, and I'll bring up extra blankets. Nights get fearsome cold this time of year." As they followed her up the narrow stairs, Maria whispered, "He won't give up so easily." "No," Elias agreed softly, "but neither will we." Long before first light touched the eastern sky, Elias stood at the window of his boarding house room, watching the silent street below. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, covering yesterday's tracks with a clean white blanket. But the peace was deceptive. He knew Cobb's men would be watching, waiting. A soft knock at his door made him turn. Maria stood there, already dressed and ready, her mother's Bible tucked safely in her coat. "We need to leave," she whispered. "Don't we?" Elias nodded. "While it's still dark. Cobb will have men watching the main roads by sunrise." They crept downstairs, avoiding the creaky third step that Mrs. Whitaker had warned them about. The mare was where they'd left her in the stable, drowsing in fresh straw. She nickered softly as Elias saddled her, careful to keep the leather quiet against the cold metal of the buckles. The sky was still black when they led her out the back way, past sleeping houses and silent shops. Fresh snow muffled their footsteps. At the edge of town, Elias helped Maria mount, then swung up behind her. Instead of taking the valley road north toward home, he guided the mare east, toward the timber country. "Longer way around," he murmured close to Maria's ear, "but safer. Cobb's men won't expect it." She nodded, pulling her coat tighter against the pre-dawn chill. They rode in silence as the stars faded and gray light began seeping into the sky. The mare's hooves crunched steadily through the snow, her breath streaming white in the cold air. By mid-morning, they were deep in the pine forest. Massive trunks rose around them like ship's masts, their branches heavy with snow. The going was slower here, picking their way between the trees, but at least they'd left no obvious trail to follow. They stopped only briefly at midday to rest the horse and share some bread and dried meat from their saddlebags. Elias kept watching their back trail, hand never far from his rifle. "You've done this before," Maria observed quietly. "Being hunted." Elias's face remained impassive, but his eyes grew distant. "Once or twice. Long time ago." They pushed on through the afternoon, climbing steadily into higher country. The forest changed around them, the big pines giving way to twisted junipers and wind-bent spruce. When darkness began falling, they found a sheltered spot to make camp near a narrow canyon, its walls rising black against the darkening sky. "Best we can do tonight," Elias said, helping Maria down. "Canyon'll guard our back at least." They didn't risk a fire, sharing cold biscuits and beef jerky instead. The temperature dropped sharply as night settled in. Maria huddled in both blankets while Elias took first watch, his rifle across his knees as he sat with his back against a boulder. The night passed slowly. They took turns sleeping and watching, speaking little. The only sounds were the soft whisper of wind through the trees and the occasional cry of a nightbird. The mare stood quiet in her picket, occasionally stamping a hoof in the snow. False dawn was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky when Elias heard it, the faint crunch of snow under careful footsteps. He touched Maria's shoulder gently, pressing a finger to his lips. She came awake instantly, eyes wide but silent. The first shot cracked through the pre-dawn stillness like breaking ice. Splinters flew from the tree trunk beside them as Elias shoved Maria toward the shelter of the boulders. More shots followed, the reports echoing off the canyon walls. "Stay down," Elias commanded, levering around into his rifle's chamber. He caught a glimpse of movement in the trees and fired, the heavy single-action roaring in the confined space. Someone yelped in pain. "That's one," a voice shouted, Cobb's voice. "But there's more of us than you, Thorne. Give up the girl and ride away. Last chance." Elias's answer was another shot that sent bark flying from a tree where one of Cobb's men had taken cover. The firefight continued, brief and violent. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness like lightning, the sharp crack of rifles mixed with the deeper boom of revolvers. Then sudden pain blazed across Elias's left shoulder, spinning him half around. He caught himself against the rock, keeping his grip on the rifle. Warm blood soaked his shirt sleeve. "Got him!" someone crowed from the darkness. "Rush him now!" But before they could, Maria snatched up Elias's dropped revolver. She fired 3 quick shots toward the voices, her hands steady despite never having shot a gun before. The attackers fell back, cursing. "Fall back!" Cobb shouted. "We'll get them later." Retreating footsteps crunched through the snow. Then silence fell again. Maria kept the revolver trained on the trees until the sky began to lighten, showing they were alone. "Let me see," she said, turning to Elias. She helped him shrug out of his coat, wincing at the blood-soaked sleeve. The bullet had carved a deep furrow across his shoulder muscle. "Just a graze," he grunted, but his face was pale with pain. Maria tore a strip from the hem of her dress and hurried to the stream that ran through the canyon. She filled their coffee pot with icy water and set it to boil over a tiny, carefully shielded fire. When the water was ready, she cleaned the wound as gently as she could, using the boiled cloth to bind it tight. "Thank you," Elias said quietly when she finished. He flexed his arm carefully, testing the bandage. "Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Watching you these past weeks, and my mother always said, 'Pay attention to everything useful, even if you think you'll never need it.'" "Wise woman," Elias replied. He pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly. "We need to move. They'll be back with more men once it's full light." They broke camp quickly, erasing all signs of their presence. The mare was unharmed, though nervous from the gunfire. Elias let Maria take the reins this time, his wounded arm making it hard to control the horse properly. They rode north as the sun rose, following game trails through the broken country. Elias's shoulder throbbed with every step, but he kept silent. Maria watched him closely, noting how the color slowly drained from his face as the morning wore on. The day stretched ahead of them, long and dangerous, but they were still free, still moving toward home, and now they knew beyond doubt what Cobb was willing to do to stop them. The journey home stretched into 3 grueling days. Elias's shoulder wound, though not deep, burned with every movement. The bandage Maria had fashioned from her dress grew stiff with dried blood, and fever crept into his bones as they pushed northward through the timber country. Maria insisted on riding point, her eyes sharp for any sign of pursuit. The mare picked her way carefully through the snow-laden forest, her coat dark with sweat despite the cold. They avoided the main trails, taking game paths and deer runs instead, though it meant slower going. "We should rest," Maria said on the afternoon of the 3rd day, noting how Elias swayed in the saddle behind her. His good hand, gripping her waist for balance, trembled slightly. "No." His voice was hoarse but determined. "Cabin's less than 2 hours ahead. We make it there, we can defend it." The sun hung low in the western sky when they finally emerged from the trees into the familiar valley. Fresh snow had fallen while they were gone, smoothing the landscape into gentle white waves. Their tracks from days ago had vanished completely. Elias felt Maria tense as the cabin came into view. Something was wrong. The door stood open, swinging slightly in the wind. Dark shapes lay scattered in the snow around the building, their supplies strewn about like a child's forgotten toys. "Wait here," he murmured, sliding stiffly from the saddle. His rifle felt heavy in his weakened hands as he approached the cabin. Inside was worse than the exterior suggested. The stove lay on its side, pipe torn free from the roof. Their food stores, flour, beans, dried meat, were gone. What couldn't be carried had been trampled into the dirt floor. Even the straw tick mattress had been slashed, feathers scattered like dirty snow across the room. "Elias!" Maria's urgent whisper carried from outside. "Riders coming!" He stumbled back through the doorway, but it was already too late. The thunder of hooves filled the valley as riders emerged from the tree line on both sides. 6 men, moving fast, led by the broad figure of Silas Cobb himself. Elias raised his rifle, but the fever made his hands shake. Before he could steady his aim, 2 riders were on him. A rifle butt crashed against his temple, sending him sprawling in the snow. His weapon spun away into the gathering dusk. "No!" Maria's scream cut through the pounding in his head. He tried to push himself up, but his wounded arm gave way beneath him. Through blurred vision, he saw her kick and fight as Cobb's men dragged her from the mare's back. "Feisty one, ain't she?" Cobb's laugh was ugly as he dismounted. He strode over to where Elias lay struggling to rise. "Should have taken my offer back in town, Thorn. Could have walked away clean." "Let her go," Elias ground out through clenched teeth. Blood from the new head wound trickled into his eye. "Now why would I do that?" Cobb planted a boot on Elias's chest, pressing him back into the snow. "That spring of hers waters half the valley. Once we're properly married tonight, it'll all be legal and proper like." He turned to his men. "Get her on a horse, we've got a preacher waiting." Maria fought like a wildcat as they bound her hands. "I'll never marry you," she spat. "The deed is filed. The land is mine." "Deeds can be changed," Cobb said smoothly. "Or lost. Tragic, really, how many important papers burn up in accidents." He ground his heel against Elias's ribs. "As for you, if you're smart, you'll lay there till we're gone. Try to follow." He drew his revolver, pointing it at Elias's head. "Well, next time we won't just crease you." Elias could only watch helplessly as they lifted Maria onto one of their horses. She caught his gaze, her eyes wide with fear but still fierce. Then Cobb swung into his saddle, and they were moving. The thunder of hooves faded into the gathering darkness. Elias lay in the blood-stained snow, his head spinning, unable to rise. The open cabin door creaked in the wind. Somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote began to howl. Night was falling fast now, bringing with it a bone-deep cold. If he stayed here much longer, he would freeze. Gritting his teeth against the pain, Elias forced himself to his hands and knees. The world tilted sickeningly, but he kept moving, one hand in front of the other, crawling through the snow toward where his rifle had fallen. The mare still stood where they'd left her, steam rising from her flanks in the chill air. She nickered softly as Elias used her saddle to pull himself upright. His fingers were numb as he checked the rifle's action. 3 cartridges left. Not much, he thought grimly, but it would have to be enough. Inside the ransacked cabin, he found his spare ammunition box kicked under the overturned stove. Small blessing. His head throbbed viciously as he loaded his pockets with cartridges. The wound in his shoulder had torn open again, fresh blood soaking through Maria's makeshift bandage. None of that mattered now. What mattered was that Maria was in Cobb's hands, being taken to some mockery of a wedding that would steal her land and her freedom. Elias had promised to protect her. He had failed once already, letting her be taken from her mother's homestead. He would not fail her again. Leaning heavily on the doorframe, he looked out into the darkening valley. Cobb's tracks led south toward town. They had maybe a 2-hour head start. In his current condition, following them would be close to suicide. But he was already moving toward the mare, checking her girth, making sure his rifle was secure in its scabbard. The cold air burned in his lungs as he pulled himself into the saddle. His vision swam, but he forced himself to focus on the tracks leading away into the gathering night. "Come on, old girl," he murmured to the mare, turning her south. "One more ride." The cabin fell away behind them as they set out into the darkness. Snow began to fall softly, gradually erasing the tracks they followed. But Elias knew where they were headed, and this time, when he faced Cobb, only one of them would walk away. The mare's labored breathing echoed in Elias's ears as he guided her through the darkening timber. His head throbbed with each hoofbeat, and the wound in his shoulder burned like fire. But he knew these woods, even in his fevered state. Henry Whitebird's hunting camp lay less than an hour's ride ahead, tucked into a protected draw where the old scout spent his winters. Snow began falling more heavily, thick flakes catching in the mare's mane. Elias hunched lower in the saddle, fighting to stay conscious. The trees blurred together in the gathering gloom, but he forced himself to focus on landmarks. The lightning-struck pine, the boulder shaped like a bear's head, the creek bend where wild mint grew in summer. Finally, he caught the faint scent of wood smoke. Through the trees ahead, a dim orange glow flickered. Henry's fire. The mare snorted softly as they approached the camp. A figure rose from beside the flames, rifle at ready. Even in the poor light, Elias recognized Henry's distinctive silhouette. Tall and straight-backed despite his years, wrapped in a wool army blanket against the cold. "Who comes?" Henry's quiet voice carried clearly through the snow-muffled air. "Thorn?" Elias managed to croak out. "Need help, Henry?" The Apache scout moved forward swiftly as Elias swayed in the saddle. Strong hands caught him as he half fell, half slid from the mare's back. Henry helped him to the fire, noting the blood-soaked bandage and the fresh wound at his temple. "Bad business," Henry said, easing Elias down onto a log. He pressed a tin cup of hot coffee into Elias's trembling hands. "Tell me." Elias took a deep swallow of the bitter liquid, letting its warmth spread through his chest. His voice was rough as he explained about Maria, the spring deed, and Cobb's ambush at the cabin. Henry's weathered face grew still as stone as he listened. "Maria's mother was my cousin," Henry said when Elias finished. He stood, moving to check his own horse, a sturdy paint pony ground-tied nearby. "We hunt Cobb together." "Storm's coming," Elias said, gesturing at the thickening snowfall. "Could work for us. Cover our tracks, mask our approach." Henry nodded, already gathering his gear. "First, we see Reverend Wycliffe. He knows Cobb's ways, has stood against him before." He returned to the fire, kneeling to examine Elias's wounds. "But you need tending, or you will fall from the saddle." Despite Elias's protests, Henry insisted on cleaning and rebinding both injuries. His practiced hands worked quickly, using a poultice of herbs from his medicine pouch for the shoulder wound. The pounding in Elias's head eased slightly as Henry tied a fresh bandage. "Now we ride," Henry said, stamping out the fire. "Your mare is tired. Take my paint. He is fresh and sure-footed." They mounted up, Henry leading them back toward the valley on a route that avoided the main trails. The snow fell steadily now, driven by a rising wind. Elias fought to stay focused, grateful for the paint pony's steady gait. His fever still burned, but Henry's poultice had taken some of the fire from his shoulder. The small Methodist church appeared through the swirling snow like a ghost, its white-painted boards almost invisible against the storm. A lamp still burned in the window of the attached cabin where Reverend Wycliffe lived. Henry dismounted first, moving silent as a shadow to knock at the door. The Reverend answered quickly, as if he had been expecting trouble on such a night. His eyes widened at the sight of Elias's condition, but he listened grimly as Henry explained their purpose. "Cobb means to force a marriage," Wycliffe said, his usual gentle manner hardening. "He sent word earlier, demanding I perform the ceremony tonight. When I refused, he said he would find another preacher who would." The Reverend's jaw set firmly. "I will not let this stand." He disappeared briefly into the cabin, returning with his coat and rifle. "Brother Matthews over in Silver Creek has always been friendly to Cobb's interests," he said, mounting his own horse. "That's likely where they're headed." "Too far," Henry said, shaking his head. "Storm coming hard now. Cobb will take her to his ranch instead. Wait for morning." "Agreed," Wycliffe nodded. "And that works in our favor. I know a back way in through the old creek bed. Used it once before when I helped one of his hands escape after Cobb beat him senseless." The three riders set out into the thickening storm, letting Henry take the lead. The Apache scout's eyes seemed to pierce the swirling snow, finding paths where others would see only white darkness. They kept to the trees where possible, using the wind-thrown drifts to muffle their horses' hooves. Elias felt consciousness slipping occasionally, but forced himself to stay alert. The paint pony followed Henry's mount surely, requiring little guidance. Behind him, he could hear Reverend Wycliffe murmuring prayers into the wind. After what seemed like hours, Henry raised his hand for a halt. Through the curtain of snow, Elias could make out lights ahead, the windows of Cobb's ranch house. Several horses stood in the shelter of a lean-to, snow building on their backs. Fresh tracks led to the main door, partially filled by the continuing storm. 6, maybe 7 men inside, Henry whispered, reading the signs. Most in the main room, 2 walking guard outside. Reverend Wycliffe pointed to their left. Creek bed runs behind the barn. We can approach from there, use the storm for cover. They dismounted, leaving the horses ground-tied in a thick stand of pine. Elias's legs nearly buckled as his boots hit the snow, but he forced himself to stay upright. His rifle felt like lead in his hands, but he checked the action anyway, making sure snow hadn't worked its way into the mechanism. Henry moved ahead like a shadow, leading them in a wide arc through the timber. The wind drove snow into their faces, but it also covered any sound of their passage. Twice they froze as guards passed nearby, barely visible through the white curtain of the storm. The creek bed was a dark gash in the snow-covered ground. They slid down into it one by one, using its depth for cover as they approached the barn. Voices carried faintly on the wind, angry shouts from inside the ranch house, followed by the sound of breaking glass. "Maria," Elias whispered, recognizing her voice raised in defiance. His fever-clouded mind cleared slightly, focused by concern for her safety. Henry touched his arm, pointing. Through the snow, they could see figures moving inside the ranch house windows. One seemed to be struggling with another. More shouting erupted, followed by the sharp crack of a slap. Elias started forward, but Reverend Wycliffe's hand on his shoulder stopped him. "Wait," the preacher breathed. "Guards are changing positions. When they move to the far side..." They huddled in the creek bed, snow building on their shoulders. Elias fought to control his shivering, knowing the shaking would throw off his aim. His shoulder throbbed in time with his heartbeat. The guards' boots crunched through the snow as they made their rounds. Henry's hand lifted, signaling. The guards had moved to the far side of the house. Now was their chance. As one, they rose from the creek bed, moving swift and silent through the deepening snow toward the ranch house door. The wind rose to a howl, hiding any sound of their approach. They were nearly to the steps when a shout went up from inside. "Get your hands off me!" Maria's voice rang out clearly. The sound of another slap echoed through the door. Elias didn't hesitate. He hit the door with his good shoulder, bursting through into the warm light of the main room. His rifle came up automatically, finding targets through his fever-blurred vision. Cobb stood in the center of the room, one hand raised to strike Maria again. She had backed against the far wall, a thin trickle of blood at the corner of her mouth, but her eyes still blazed with defiance. 4 of Cobb's men lounged nearby, caught off guard by the sudden intrusion. "Let her go," Elias said, his voice rough but steady. Behind him, he sensed Henry and Reverend Wycliffe moving to cover the rest of the room. Cobb's face twisted with rage. "Should have killed you when I had the chance, Thorne." His hand dropped to his gun belt. "Stop!" Reverend Wycliffe's voice cracked like a whip. "There's been enough violence tonight." Snow whirled through the darkness like a living thing, coating their shoulders as they crouched behind the ranch house woodpile. Elias pressed a hand against his wounded shoulder, willing the throbbing to subside. Through a frost-rimmed window, lamplight spilled across the yard, casting weak shadows on the fresh-fallen snow. Henry touched Elias's arm, pointing. Inside, they could see Maria standing rigid in Cobb's formal parlor, her face set in stubborn defiance despite the fresh bruise darkening her cheek. 2 of Cobb's ranch hands lounged nearby, pistols visible on their hips. One cleaned his nails with a knife while the other dozed in an armchair. "Marshall's horse in the barn," Henry whispered, his breath clouding in the bitter air. "Arrived just before us." Reverend Wycliffe nodded grimly. "Good. We'll need law on our side tonight." He pulled his coat tighter against the wind. "Henry, can you draw those guards outside?" The Apache scout's eyes glinted in the darkness. "Easy. They are tired, cold, want only warm fire, not guard duty." He slipped away into the swirling snow, silent as a shadow. Elias and the Reverend waited, counting heartbeats. The storm intensified, driving ice crystals against their faces. Through the window, they watched the guards snap to attention at a sudden noise from the barn. One nudged the other awake and both drew their pistols. What was that? The words carried faintly through the glass. "Check it out," the second guard ordered, already moving toward the door. The moment the guard stepped outside, Henry's plan unfolded. A horse screamed in the barn, followed by the crash of breaking wood. The guards rushed toward the sound, vanishing into the white curtain of snow. "Now," Reverend Wycliffe whispered. They moved fast despite Elias's injuries, crossing the yard in quick, crouching runs. At the front door, Elias pressed his back to the wall while the Reverend tested the latch. It opened smoothly, letting out a wash of warm air scented with pipe smoke and coffee. Voices drifted from the parlor, Cobb's arrogant drawl rising above the others. "Marshal, once the ceremony's done tomorrow, the water rights transfer to me legal and proper. No need to worry about that deed she claims exists." "Mighty convenient timing, Cobb." The marshal's voice held a note of skepticism. "Girl shows up with proof of ownership, and suddenly you're set on marriage?" Elias eased around the doorframe, keeping to the shadows of the entrance hall. His rifle felt heavy in his fevered hands, but his grip remained steady. The Reverend moved beside him, his own weapon held low but ready. In the parlor, Cobb stood with his back to the fire, addressing a weather-beaten man who could only be the marshal. 4 more ranch hands clustered near the windows, while Maria stood isolated near a writing desk, her shoulders straight despite her obvious exhaustion. "The girl needs protection," Cobb was saying. "Her mother's gone, no family to speak of. Marriage to an established rancher is the best thing for her." "I have family," Maria's voice cut through the room like steel. "My mother's people still hold hunting rights in these mountains, and I have the deed to prove my claim to the spring." Cobb's face darkened. He took a step toward her, hand raised. "You'll learn to mind that tongue, girl, or what, Cobb?" Elias's challenge froze everyone in place. He stepped into the parlor doorway, rifle trained on Cobb's chest. The ranch hands reached for their guns, but stopped as Reverend Wycliffe appeared beside him. "Evening, Marshal," the Reverend said calmly. "Glad you're here to witness this." The Marshal's hand rested near his own holster as he studied the scene. "Reverend, care to explain what's going on?" "Gladly." Wycliffe moved further into the room, keeping his rifle ready but pointed downward. "We're here to prevent a forced marriage and present evidence of Mr. Cobb's attempted theft of legal water rights." Outside, the wind howled against the windows. Snow crystals clicked against the glass like tiny bullets. Henry materialized from the shadows of the hallway, taking position where he could watch both the room and the rear entrance. "This is my house," Cobb snarled. "You're trespassing." "We're here lawfully," Elias said, fighting to keep his voice steady as fever threatened to blur his vision, "to prevent a crime and protect an innocent woman." Maria seized the moment to dart away from the desk, putting distance between herself and Cobb. Her eyes met Elias's briefly, showing relief mixed with concern at his obvious illness. The marshal raised his hands, addressing the room. "Everyone stay calm. Let's sort this out proper." He turned to Maria. "Young lady, you mentioned a deed?" "Yes, sir." She reached into her dress pocket, withdrawing the carefully folded document. "My mother's family was granted these water rights 40 years ago. The spring has served both settlers and Apache people fairly since then." She handed the paper to the marshal. "The Territorial Land Office is confirming it now." The marshal examined the deed carefully, holding it close to the lamplight. "Seal looks genuine. Signatures appear correct." He looked up at Reverend Wycliffe. "You've seen this document?" "I have," the Reverend confirmed. "Witnessed it myself when she first showed it to us. Henry Whitebird here can also testify to its authenticity, having known Maria's mother and her people for many years." Henry nodded solemnly. "Is true. Spring belongs to her family by right and law." Cobb's face had grown progressively darker. "That paper means nothing. Girl's under contract to me for debt. Everything she owns is mine until it's paid." "A false debt," Elias growled. "Created after her mother's death to steal her land." "You can't prove that," Cobb sneered. Perhaps not, Reverend Wycliffe said quietly. But we can prove attempted kidnapping, assault, and conspiracy to force marriage for financial gain. He met the marshal's eyes. All crimes under territorial law, I believe. The marshal nodded slowly, still studying the deed. That they are, Reverend. He turned to Maria. Miss Greyhawk, do you wish to marry Mr. Cobb of your own free will? No, sir, Maria said firmly. He tried to force me, threatened me, struck me when I refused. She touched her bruised cheek. He only wants the spring water rights that rightfully belong to my family. A tense silence filled the room, broken only by the storm's continued assault on the windows. The marshal folded the deed carefully, then faced Cobb. Way I see it, he said, we've got witness documentation of legal ownership, multiple credible accounts of criminal behavior, and clear evidence of assault. His hand moved to rest openly on his holster. Mr. Cobb, I'm afraid you'll need to come with me to the county seat to answer some questions. Cobb's face contorted with rage. This is ridiculous. I own half this valley. Ownership doesn't put you above the law, the marshal said firmly. Your men will stay here under the Reverend's observation while we ride to town. He gestured to two of the ranch hands. Disarm them. The hands hesitated, looking to Cobb. Their employer's face worked through several shades of purple before he spat out, Do as he says. While the marshal supervised the collection of weapons, Maria moved to Elias's side. Her cool hand touched his fevered forehead. You're burning up, she whispered. The wound? Elias managed a weak smile. Worth it, to see justice done. Henry appeared beside them, supporting Elias's wavering stance. Need to get him warm, tend to injuries proper, he said to Maria. Storm still bad outside. The marshal, now holding Cobb's gun belt, turned to them. Reverend, can you handle things here while I escort Mr. Cobb to town? We'll need statements from all of you once the weather clears. Of course, Wycliffe replied. I suggest Mr. Thorne and Miss Greyhawk stay at my church until then. It's neutral ground, and he needs medical attention. The marshal nodded agreement. Probably safest, Mr. Whitebird, would you help them get there safely? I'll send the doctor out once I've delivered our friend to the jail. Cobb stood rigid as the marshal bound his hands. This isn't over, he growled at Maria. That spring, Maria interrupted, will continue to serve everyone in the valley fairly, just as my mother intended. Her voice carried quiet authority. But it will do so under my family's rightful ownership. The marshal led Cobb out into the storm, where two horses waited under the shelter of the porch roof. The ranch hands, now disarmed, watched sullenly as Henry and the Reverend helped Elias toward the door, Maria close behind. Outside, the snow had begun to ease slightly, though wind still whipped between the buildings. Their horses waited patiently where they had left them, protected by the pine grove. Henry helped Elias mount, then swung up behind him to ensure he wouldn't fall. As they rode away from Cobb's ranch, Elias felt Maria's hand squeeze his briefly. Through the haze of fever, he saw gratitude and something warmer in her eyes. The Reverend led them toward his church, its steeple barely visible through the swirling snow, while behind them hoofbeats marked the marshal and his prisoner's departure toward town. Justice had been served, Elias thought hazily, and not a shot fired. Sometimes the law could work as intended, especially with good people willing to stand up for what was right. The thought comforted him as consciousness began to slip away, secure in the knowledge that Maria was safe and her inheritance protected. The marshal pulled a worn leather notebook from his coat, flipping through pages yellowed by time and weather. His breath clouded in the lamplight of Cobb's parlor as he reviewed the evidence before him. Outside, the storm continued its assault, rattling windows and whistling through every crack in the ranch house walls. Let's make this official, he said, voice carrying the weight of authority. The deed filed in the county seat matches this document exactly. Miss Greyhawk's claim to the spring and surrounding lands is legitimate. He turned to face Cobb directly. Furthermore, I have 3 respected witnesses, Reverend Wycliffe, Henry Whitebird, and Elias Thorne, all testifying to attempted kidnapping and coercion. Cobb's face flushed deeper red, the veins in his neck standing out like rope. "You can't." "I can and I will," the marshal cut him off. "Miss Greyhawk is to be released immediately. Any further attempts to claim ownership of her person or property will result in your arrest." He gestured toward Maria. "You're free to go, miss." Maria straightened her spine, chin lifting with quiet dignity. Her eyes, bright with unshed tears of relief, met Elias's across the room. He managed a small nod despite the fever burning through him, pride warming his chest at her composure. Around the parlor, the assembled ranch hands shifted uneasily. 3 of them exchanged glances, then moved toward the door, spurs jingling softly on the wooden floor. "Where do you think you're going?" Cobb demanded. One of them, a weathered man with gray threading his beard, paused in the doorway. "Reckon we're done here, Mr. Cobb. Signed on to work cattle, not break laws." 2 more hands followed him out into the storm. Reverend Wycliffe cleared his throat. "I believe it's time we all took our leave." He moved to support Elias, who had begun swaying slightly where he stood. "Mr. Thorne needs medical attention, and this weather isn't improving." Henry Whitebird materialized from the shadows where he'd been watching. "My camp not far. Safe place to rest, tend wounds." He nodded to Maria. "Your mother's people always welcome there." Cobb surged forward suddenly, fists clenched. "This isn't over, that spring dash." The marshal's hand dropped to his holster. "That's enough, Cobb. One more threat and you'll spend the night in my jail instead of your warm bed." His stern gaze swept the room. "The law's been satisfied here. Let's all go our separate ways, peaceful-like." Maria gathered her shawl around her shoulders, moving to stand beside Elias and Henry. Her voice carried clearly through the tense atmosphere. "The spring will serve the valley as it always has. Anyone who needs water for their stock is welcome to it, so long as they respect the land and its rightful owners." The simple dignity of her words seemed to deflate what remained of Cobb's bluster. He stood rigid, watching as they made their way to the door, the marshal's warning gaze never leaving him. Outside, the storm had begun to ease slightly, though wind still carved channels through the deep snow. Their horses waited where they'd left them, huddled against the weather in the shelter of the pine grove. Henry helped Elias mount, noting how the wounded man's hands shook with fever as he gripped the reins. "Lean forward," Henry instructed, swinging up behind him. "Save strength for riding." Maria mounted her own horse while Reverend Wycliffe took the lead position. They set out single file, leaving the warm glow of Cobb's windows behind. The marshal stood on the porch, watching until they disappeared into the swirling snow. The journey to Henry's camp took over an hour through the darkness. The moon occasionally broke through racing clouds, casting brief silver light across the pristine drifts. Their horses picked their way carefully along game trails and narrow passages between rocks, guided by Henry's intimate knowledge of the land. Finally, they descended into a sheltered hollow where several sturdy lodges stood, their smoke holes releasing thin streams of wood smoke into the night air. Henry's family emerged at their approach, his wife Sarah, their daughter, and 2 sons, helping them dismount and leading the tired horses to shelter. Inside Henry's lodge, the temperature rose quickly as Sarah built up the fire. Maria helped Elias settle onto a bed of blankets while Henry gathered healing supplies. The Reverend accepted a tin cup of coffee with grateful hands, warming himself by the flames. "Need to clean wound proper," Henry said, kneeling beside Elias with a collection of herbs and bandages. "Fever bad sign." Maria watched anxiously as Henry exposed the shoulder injury, her face tightening at the angry red flesh around the bullet graze. "Will he be all right?" Henry nodded, beginning to wash the wound with a steaming herbal solution. "Strong man, good spirit. Will heal." He glanced up at her with a slight smile. Thanks to brave woman who helped him fight for justice. Sarah brought more coffee, passing cups to Maria and the Reverend. "Your mother would be proud," she said softly to Maria. "She always said you had her strength." The Reverend sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "The marshal's ruling will be recorded officially tomorrow. No one can challenge your ownership of the spring now." He patted the deed, safely stored in his coat pocket. I'll keep this in the church safe until you're ready to reclaim your mother's cabin." Elias stirred, his voice rough but clear. "We'll help you rebuild. Make it proper again." Maria's eyes glistened in the firelight. "I don't know how to thank you all, for believing me, for standing with me." "No thanks needed between family," Henry said firmly, continuing his careful treatment of Elias's wound. "Your mother was clan sister to my wife. Makes you clan daughter." He gestured to the lodge around them. "Always have home here." The Reverend set his empty cup aside. "I should head back to town. Make sure the marshal has everything he needs for the official record." He stood, brushing off his coat. "Will you all be safe here?" Henry nodded. "Storm coming worse soon. Better stay few days. Let Elias heal." He glanced at Maria. "Give time for things to settle in Valley." "I'll send word when it's safe to return," the Reverend promised. He clasped Maria's hand briefly. "God's justice was served today, child. Rest easy in that." After the Reverend departed, Sarah served bowls of rich venison stew. The lodge grew quiet except for the crack of burning wood and the muffled howl of wind outside. Henry's children curled up in their blankets, while Sarah continued her quiet work with needle and sinew nearby. Elias dozed fitfully as the herbs in Henry's medicine began to work, the fever slowly releasing its grip. Maria sat beside him, occasionally dabbing his forehead with a cool cloth. Her thoughts drifted to the future, restoring her mother's cabin, tending the spring, building a new life that honored both sides of her heritage. Henry watched them both with knowing eyes as he carefully packed away his healing supplies. "Sleep now," he advised. "Tomorrow brings new day, new beginnings." Outside, the storm wrapped the hollow in deepening snow, but within the lodge, warmth and safety prevailed. Maria pulled her blanket closer, listening to the peaceful breathing of those around her. For the first time in many months, she felt truly free, free to choose her path, free to honor her mother's memory, free to build the life she dreamed of. The coffee pot bubbled softly on the fire's edge, filling the air with its rich aroma. Henry's wife hummed an old Apache lullaby as she worked, the gentle sound weaving through the storm's voice like a promise of spring to come. Here, surrounded by friends who had become family, Maria finally allowed herself to fully relax, secure in the knowledge that justice had prevailed and her future was her own to shape. The April sun hung bright in a pearl blue sky as snowmelt thundered down from the high country. Winter's grip had finally loosened, leaving behind muddy paths and the first tender shoots of green grass pushing through remaining patches of snow. The air carried the sweet promise of spring, mingled with wood smoke from the cooking fire where Maria tended a massive iron pot of venison stew. Elias stood on his newly repaired cabin porch, marveling at the transformation before him. Where months ago there had been only pristine isolation, now the yard bustled with life. Children's laughter rang out as they chased each other through puddles, their mothers calling out occasional warnings in English and Apache. Henry Whitebird's sons showed several settler boys how to shoot arrows at a target, while their fathers discussed grazing patterns and spring planting nearby. The cabin itself bore little resemblance to the ransacked shell they'd found after Cobb's attack. Fresh-cut logs had replaced the damaged ones, the roof was newly chinked, and Maria had hung bright woven blankets in the windows. Even the old woodshed had been rebuilt, now stocked with enough split cordwood to last well into summer. Sarah Whitebird approached the cooking fire carrying a basket of fresh-baked bread. "Smells good enough to bring the whole valley running," she said, smiling at Maria. "I hope so," Maria replied, stirring the rich broth. "That's why we're here, isn't it? To show everyone the spring can bring people together instead of pushing them apart." Elias watched as she ladled out a small taste, testing the seasoning. The confident way she moved around his cabin now, their cabin, if he was honest with himself, struck him deeply. Gone was the frightened girl from the auction block, replaced by a woman who knew her own mind and worth. Reverend Wycliffe's wagon rattled up the muddy trail, loaded with extra chairs and tables borrowed from the church. His wife Rebecca sat beside him, holding a covered dish, while their young daughter Mary bounced excitedly in the back. "Need any help with those, Reverend?" Elias called out, descending the porch steps. "Much obliged, Elias," Wycliffe answered, setting the brake. "Seems half the town wanted to contribute something once they heard about the gathering." Together they unloaded the wagon, setting up rough-hewn tables in the yard. More families arrived. Miners from the northern claims, ranchers from the lower valley. Even the marshal and his wife made an appearance. Each brought food to share: pies, beans, cornbread, dried fruit compote. The tables groaned under the weight of community generosity. Children darted between adult legs as the gathering grew. 2 Apache grandmothers taught a cluster of settler women their technique for grinding corn, while nearby a weathered rancher demonstrated rope tricks to a mixed group of youngsters. The spring itself burbled merrily in the background, its clear waters a constant reminder of why they had all come together. Maria moved through the crowd with natural grace, making everyone feel welcome. She spoke Apache with Henry's family, Spanish with several Mexican vaqueros who'd ridden up from the South Valley, and English with the townspeople. Each conversation seemed to weave another strand in the tapestry of community being created. When the sun reached its zenith, Reverend Wycliffe raised his hands for attention. The crowd gradually quieted, forming a rough circle around the food-laden tables. Even the children settled, sensing the importance of the moment. "Friends and neighbors," the Reverend began, his voice carrying clearly in the spring air. "We gather today to give thanks. Thanks for the bounty before us, thanks for the peace in our valley, and thanks for the water that sustains us all." He gestured toward the spring. "This water flows freely as God intended, bringing life to every corner of our community. Let it remind us that we are all His children, regardless of where we came from or what language we speak." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The Reverend continued, "Let us bow our heads in prayer." Elias watched as heads bowed, gray-haired settlers beside braided Apache warriors, children of all backgrounds standing shoulder to shoulder. The Reverend's prayer rose like smoke to the bright sky. "Heavenly Father, we thank you for this food, for this day of fellowship, and for teaching us that justice flows like water, bringing healing where there was strife. Bless this gathering and the hands that prepared it. Amen." "Amen," the crowd echoed, and then the feast began in earnest. Maria served her stew first, the rich aroma drawing appreciative comments from all who received a bowl. Elias helped, making sure the elders and children were served before taking his own portion. The food disappeared quickly amid conversation and laughter, barriers falling away as stories were shared across the tables. As the afternoon wore on, music began. Henry's oldest son produced a fiddle, while one of the Mexican vaqueros contributed a guitar. Soon the yard filled with impromptu dancing, children spinning in circles, couples stepping carefully through old country reels, and even a few brave souls attempting to learn traditional Apache social dances under Sarah's patient instruction. Elias found himself drawn to the edge of the gathering, overwhelmed by the joy of it all. He remembered that cold morning at the Labor Girl Market, the desperation in Maria's eyes as she'd begged him to bid. "Buy me before they do," she'd said, and those words had changed everything. He'd thought he was saving her, but in truth, she'd saved him. From loneliness, from the bitter shell he'd become after losing his wife and unborn child. The sun was setting when Maria found him, touching his arm gently. "Everything all right?" He nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Just thinking about how different things were a few months ago." "I've been thinking too," she said, watching the celebration continue in the gathering dusk. "I've decided to stay, at least until next winter." She glanced up at him. "There's still so much to learn about running a homestead properly, and Henry's wife offered to teach me more of the old ways. Medicines, crafts, stories I should know about my mother's people." Relief flooded through Elias, though he tried not to show it too plainly. "Reckon there's plenty of work here to keep us both busy," he said carefully. "Garden needs planting. Roof still leaks in the corner bedroom when it rains hard." Maria smiled, understanding all he wasn't saying. "Yes, it does. And someone needs to make sure you don't fall through any more ice." Their quiet laughter joined the general merriment as lanterns were lit around the yard. The fiddle struck up another tune, slower this time, and more couples began to dance. The spring's voice provided gentle accompaniment, its waters catching the last rays of sunset in golden sparkles. Reverend Wycliffe approached, looking pleased with the day's success. "Fine gathering, Elias. Fine gathering indeed." He gestured to where several men were already making plans for shared cattle drives and trading arrangements. Amazing what can happen when people choose to see each other as neighbors instead of enemies. "Wasn't my doing," Elias replied honestly. "Maria's the one who showed us all a better way." The Reverend smiled knowingly. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, friend. Sometimes it takes a special kind of courage to help us find our way back to faith. Faith in God, in justice, in each other." As evening settled fully over the valley, the gathering began to wind down. Families collected sleepy children, promises were made to meet again soon, and wagons creaked back down the trail toward town. The Apache families would camp nearby tonight, continuing the celebration in their own way under the stars. Elias stood on his porch once more, watching the last of the visitors depart. The valley spread out before him, peaceful in the growing darkness. Lamplight glowed warmly through the cabin windows behind him, where Maria was putting away the last of the cooking supplies. The spring song carried clearly in the quiet air, a constant reminder of the day's miracle of unity. He remembered the bitter man he'd been just months ago, choosing solitude over connection, nursing old griefs instead of opening himself to new possibilities. Maria's arrival had changed everything, not just for him, but for the entire community. Her courage in standing up to Cobb, her grace in victory, and her vision of the spring as something to share rather than possess had transformed the valley. The night air carried the scent of spring growth and wood smoke. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called, and another answered. Elias took a deep breath, feeling truly at peace for the first time in years. The warmth from the cabin beckoned, promising not just shelter but home in its deepest sense, a place of belonging, of purpose, of renewed faith in the goodness that could bloom even in the hardest soil. If this one resonated with you, stick around. I've got another story waiting for you tomorrow, and who knows, it might be just what you needed to hear.